Buenas tardes. Vamos a comenzar ya porque el programa que nos queda todavía es bastante apretadillo también, ¿no? Entonces, la última de las lecciones magistrales la va a dar esta tarde la profesora Evridiki Kefalidou, lo digo mejor en su idioma original, ¿no? Que es profesora de la Universidad Capodistríaca de Atenas. Me encanta lo de Capodistríaca, un día me lo explicas. Y ella fue antes también conservadora del Museo de Salónica, donde nos conocimos hace ya muchos años, llevamos ya muchos años de amistad. Y hoy nos va a hablar sobre, sobre la cerámica ática de Abdera y su ampliación en la región de la Tracia Egea, ¿no? Bueno, sin más, le cedo la palabra y haremos el debate, yo creo, al final. Θα κάνουμε μετά...
τις ερωτήσεις. Ναι, ό,τι θέλεις. Εντάξει. Okay. So, good afternoon to all of you. Avira was a double Ionian colony initially founded in the middle of the 7th century BC by citizens of the Greek city of Clazomenae on the peninsula of Erythrea in Asia Minor. A century later, around the middle of the 6th century BC, Avira was recolonized by citizens of Theos, another Greek city, friendly city to Clazomenae, and located very close to Clazomenae. Sailing between the two areas was relatively short. It's about 200 nautical miles. That is 2.5 to 3 days of sailing, depending on the weather and the in-between stops, if you want to stop. The first settlers must have faced numerous problems, as the location of Avira on a peninsula near the delta of River Nestos and the foothills of the Rhodope mountain range offered many advantages, to which I will return later, but also disadvantages due to its surrounding swampy grounds, which must have been a source for various diseases like malaria, and these diseases decimated the infant population. According to the anthropological studies of the bones in the graves, almost 80% of the children died before they reached the 2nd or 3rd year of age. By the way, this is my wonderful drawing showing, well, this was the best I could do, that Avira was only here in this peninsula. This was the ancient bed of River Nestos, and these are the swamps, the lagoons, and all these, and partly it was sea. The earliest Attic pots from the city of Avira are a few transport amphoras of the well-known SOS type. I know 5 examples, but there must be fragments of a few others. 1 or 2 of them date to the middle of the 7th century, while the others date around 600 BC. These amphoras are a very small part of about 200 to 150 transport amphoras from various areas of the East Aegean and a few from mainland Greece that have been found as burial containers for inhumations in the cemeteries of the first colonies, the Clazomenians. In any case, the earlier SOS amphoras, together with other similar containers, amphoras from other areas, date at the time at which the colonists settled for the first time. Thus, we have 2 possibilities. First, that the settlers had brought them along from Clazomenae or from a harbor in between, such as Lesvos or Lemnos, maybe, on their way to Clazomenae. They could have been filled with olive oil, or they could have been in secondary use, filled with something else like wine, vinegar, salted fish, and any type of food. The second possibility is that the newcomers had bought them in situ in Avira from some passing ships or from a nearby area. However, the only SOS amphora from the northeast Aegean, which I know from publications, is one, and only one, from Samothrace. And this is a very interesting example because it was found in a second or the third use for the inhumation of an infant in the 4th century BC. So it was kept, this SOS amphora was kept in Samothrace for at least 200 years before it was used in a grave. Anyway, lately my dear colleague, Dr. Kostas Philis, told me that he has many SOS amphora fragments in the sherds that he studies from the sanctuary of Parthenos in Neapolis to the sanctuary I will return later, because I was really worried that these are the only amphoras, Attic amphoras. Anyway, if they had Attic olive oil, there is a problem because their metropolis, Clazomenae, had a large production and export of olive oil. So the question is, why did they need Attic olive oil if they brought it with them? However, we should keep in mind that Attic SOS amphoras were reaching areas very close to Clazomenae, like Phokia, which is somewhere over here. In any case, the earliest Attic vases came to Avira in the middle of the 7th century, and they came for their contents, whatever they were, and not as utensils, not as vases themselves. And then we have our first gap. There are no Attic transport amphoras after 600 BC. In fact, this is not a problem. We have so far the real problem to identify securely dated pottery, or at least fine pottery of any type, that belongs into the time span from 560 until 520 BC. During this time, these years, the second wave of colonizers comes to Avira from Teos. The historical sources put this second colonization wave at 545 BC, but these dates, of course, are circa. The Teans mingled with a few left Clazomenians, and in the course of 20, 30 years, let's say in one generation, they really changed the history of this colony. During the last decades of the 6th century BC, we have the earliest Attic black figure vases that I mean fine pottery, almost all of which are small in size and belong to the well-known mass production workshops like this one from the Fanilis group. An interesting exception in these late 6th, early 5th century vases is the cup on the top left, which was covered, it is still covered partly with coral red and can also be dated around 500 BC. Moving on, during the first decades of the 5th century BC, Attic pottery is again represented by some specimens of the most prolific workshops of the era, like the Hemon group, the Beldam group, the Light Make class, and other similar ones. I just show you some examples here. Interestingly enough, the two Lekithoi on the top right, the black figure and the red figure, were found in the same grave, and this is interesting both for dating purposes as well as for throwing some light on the tastes of the local buyers. Almost all these pots were found in graves, but this does not mean that they were initially bought for burial use. But this discussion must wait until we have more excavations and studies of the pottery from the settlement area. In this screen, you can see a typical assemblage of pottery used in the graves of the first half of the 5th century BC. One small Attic vase, the trefoil jug, and a few local ones, among which the cup is by far the most common shape. The picture changes a little bit just before the middle of the 5th century, when we see at least, well, these are the best red figure vases, you see them all here, when we see at least 3 red figure vases of a higher quality, again found in graves. It's this hydria, this peliki, and this cup that you see in the showcase to the right. None of them is properly published, and they are in our to-do list, hopefully. In the same showcase in the Arqueological Museum of Avira, you can also see some red figure vases of the second half of the 5th century and of the 4th century, also unpublished. Among them, I think you can also see a plastic Likithos. Of the properly published vases, this one is interesting. It's a shallow cup with wishbone handles and polychrome decoration on white ground, dating in the 3rd quarter of the 5th century BC. This is a drawing, but the wings here are with a question mark. They are not so easily discernible as they are in the drawing. It was found in a burial pit, burned on top of the burned body that was in the tomb. Thus, it is not well preserved. You can see the situation on the top right. However, we can see 2 female figures on both sides of a boy, in front of whom there is a tree. The scene can be interpreted as an everyday event of a family, some friends gathering fruits, or a scene with Aphrodite and Eros, if the boy had wings, and a follower of the goddess, or finally Aphrodite, Persephone, and Adonis. In any case, the decoration probably has some connotations with a continuation of life in a post-mortem paradise. Although this vase was probably not imported from Attica, but was locally made, it is rather safe to say that the potter and painter had knowledge of the Athenian white ground technique and, of course, of the Athenian repertoire. I have one more photograph of another showcase in the Arqueological Museum of Avira, showing the Phanilis class lekithos that I've shown you before. And I did this on purpose to see the size, together with a selection of local and Attic vases, among which there is a tiny red figure bell crater, one of the very few specimens of this shape in Avira, as we know until today, because things, of course, may change with future research. Above this little crater, you can see a local plain vase, which could have served as an equivalent, that is for mixing wine and water in the drinking feasts. The almost total absence of proper craters of any shape, and especially column craters, is remarkable. Eleni Manakidou wrote on the large numbers of column craters, and we saw some in both lectures today. Corinthian, column craters, Corinthian, Attic, local, and others, all over the archaic North Aegean, except in Avira, as much as I can tell today. So I very proudly show you one of the 3 fragments I recognized last summer. I'm very proud to show you this one. I do not know if it's Attic or local, and I cannot give you a date because it was found in a ditch that contained waste from destroyed graves. In the meantime, though, Attic pottery of the 6th century was reaching, I think you can see the Avira is always with a pin, Fasos and its earliest colonies on the coast. That is, the earliest colonies are Neapolis and Isimi. Neapolis and Isimi must have been founded early on in the 3rd quarter of the 7th century BC. Also, Attic pottery came to the island of Samothrace and also to the township of Mesembria Zoni, over here. It is true, however, that in most cases, not in all cases, the early Attic fine pottery is found in sanctuaries like the Parthenos in Neapolis, Apollo Sanctuary in Zoni, and the Sanctuary of the Great Gods in Samothrace, while the excavations in Avira did not yet reveal any sanctuary of equal importance as this one. One more thing. Also, Attic fine painted pottery reaches the metropolis, Clazomenae, very early, already since 600 BC. We have in Clazomenae Gorgon painters, Siana cups, painted by Sophilos, and so on. But it was not moving between the metropolis and the colony, as it seems so far. In any case, through the whole of the 6th century, large numbers of fine Attic pottery arrive in the close neighborhood of Avira, namely Fasos and its early colonies or Emboria. This observation can lead us to some thoughts about the trade routes in the North Aegean and, of course, the wider issue of the colonies in the area. Let us take a look at the wider movements of the second half of the 8th century, when the Eastern and Central Mediterranean saw another wave of Greek colonization, which continued during the whole 7th century. As far as the colonization of northern Greece is concerned, there can be no doubt that the first Greeks were mainly Euboeans, who settled here after the Trojan War. The island of Fasos offered land for agriculture. Thasian wine, for example, was among the finest and best known in the ancient world, and the earliest Thasian commercial amphoras date to as early as the 500s BC. Also timber, gold, silver, iron, and lead, and marble, which were abundant on the island, and in the early 5th century brought Thasos an annual income of just under 80 talents, as Herodotus tells us. Another advantage, of course, was its proximity to the Thracian coast, about which the first colonies probably already had information, so it was not an unknown land. This may explain why the Parians who moved to Thasos, who colonized Thasos, opted to settle at the most northern end of the island, and also why, as soon as they had settled in their new home, they hurried to found their own colonies on the coast. But colonies from another island, this is Paros and this is Naxos, okay? But colonies from another island of the, and this is Andros, by the way. Another island of the Cyclades also participated in the movement. People from Andros over here founded 4 colonies, one of which was, I will show it to you now, just a few kilometers to the west of Thasos and the colonies of Thasos. Just before the middle of the 7th century, again, 655 BC, and there was another colony to the west, to the east of the Strymon River, Ion, a colony of Eretria, an earlier one. The speed with which the Parians advanced across the Thracian Perea, the coast, and I try to do my drawing here, I don't know if you like it, suggests that they were in a hurry, anxious to forestall others. And the others were first the Naxians and probably the Clazomenians, as I will try to explain below. I try to put some important time marks on the screen. 670 BC, Parian colonists arrive on Thasos. Of course, the dates, again, we take it with a bit of salt, right? They are not the exact year, and they didn't come all together on 2 ships or 3 ships or 10 ships. Parian colonists arrived on Thasos, led by Telesicles, father of the lyric poet Arqueológico. They expelled most of the Thracians who lived on the island. The Thracians moved to the opposite coast. A few years later, circa 663 BC, the age of Arqueológico, the poet, the Parians encouraged the Thracians to return to the island in order to help them against the Naxians, who were also trying to establish themselves on Thasos. This is based on the new readings of Arqueológico's poetry by Professor Kyriakos Tsantsanoglou. Now, the Thracians who came back were wiped out by the Naxians, but the latter did not manage to reach the purpose to invade the island. Many of them were eliminated by Parians, while the rest, who had fled to the Thracian coast, were exterminated by the Sapaean Thracians. Furthermore, Arqueológicos also complains about the battles in the Thracian coast, in one of which he lost his friend Glaucus, and he also lost his famous shield, or he dropped his famous shield. Anyway, during this time, it's exactly where the Clazomenian colonists arrived in the area. We can guess that maybe they find a chance to move here because the Thasians were busy fighting with the Thracians and then the Naxians, exactly during these years. But very soon, the Clazomenians must have had big trouble with diseases like malaria and the high children mortality. So in 545, the second colonization of Avira by citizens of Teos happens. But very important, from about 512, 510 BC until the very well-known date, 4 479 BC, Thrace was under Persian rule, that is more than 30 years. In fact, Herodotus says that in 492, Mardonius' fleet subdued the Thasians, who did not so much as lift up their hands against him. So there was no fight. The next year, 491, Darius sent a message bidding the Thasians, who were falsely reported by their neighbors, and there can be no other neighbors than the Aviritans, to be planning rebellion. So he demanded from the Thasians to destroy their city walls and bring their ships to Avira. And he did that. This is also known by Herodotus, of course. 11 years later, during Xerxes' invasion in 480 BC, the Thasians received and feasted the Persian army on behalf of their towns on the mainland and spent a lot, hundreds of talents, for this. And 1 year later, Xerxes came to Avira in his return to Persia when he was defeated. He made, of course, a compact of friendship with the people from Avira and gave them a golden sword and a gilt tiara. And as the people of Avira say, as a joke, it was here that Xerxes, in his flight back from Athens, first loosed his girdle, like, what is the thymos? Where's your thymos? Xerxes, your thymos, loosed his girdle as he felt that he was safe here for the first time after he lost all his battles. Now, let's take a look at Xerxes' march through this area and read the comments of Herodotus about the landscape of the wider region. Remember that the army was moving in 3 parallel groups and that it was summertime. Therefore, many of the swamps and the lagoons and the lakes must have been comparatively dry. Herodotus says, after Xerxes crossed the dried-up bed of River Lissos, so at least one of the troops of Xerxes, he passed by the Greek cities. He passed by the Greek cities of Maronia, Dikia, and Avira. Here is Avira, by the way. I think I put too many colors, but anyway. He passed by these and along certain well-known lakes near them. The Ismaris Lake, that lies between Maronia and Strimi, and near Dikia, the Bistonis Lake, into which the rivers Travers and Compsatos discharge. Near Avira, Xerxes passed no well-known lake, but crossed the river Nestos. Just to remind you that the river Nestos was very close to Avira and not where it is today. I will come back. This is today's Nestos, okay? Don't worry, I still remember that I'm in a pottery conference and not in a ancient history conference. But the thing is that pots, like people, go to places or do not go to places for a reason. And this is what I would like to suggest in regard to our next gap, which you already see here in the area of the modern Nestos River Delta, which seems like a no man's land in antiquity. Second. Back to Herodotus, again, for a little while. Near Avira, Xerxes passed no well-known lake, but crossed the river Nestos, which flows into the sea. From these regions, he passed by the cities of the mainland. One had near it a lake about 30 furlongs in circuit, full of fish and very salty. Apparently, I explained, because it was connected to the sea. It was a lagoon. And it was drained because the beasts of burden of Xerxes drank all its water. This town is called Pistyros. We now know the site of Pistyros through the excavations. Of course, now Pistyros is not near the sea, but it used to be 2,500 years ago. This is the point where Nestos exits the mountains, the narrows of Nestos, and now flows into the sea like this. But in antiquity, we have found, not me, the ancient river bends, and there are several of them, and they go towards Avira. We also know, thanks to Konstantinas Kalindzi's thorough PhD work that there are no ancient settlements in the wider area of the modern delta. Again, this is the modern delta, and this is it's obvious what it was the ancient delta. I think you can see it. This is from her book, the location of settlements, and there is nothing. It's empty here, absolutely nothing. This is what, because, by the way, this is the drainage basin of Nestos River from the Rila Mountains in Bulgaria, just to give you an idea how big, how much volume of water this river, and of course sediments, and was bringing down to the sea. These alluvial deposits must have brought considerable geomorphological changes in the area. So, what is now land used to be sea or salty ponds, lagoons, swamps, and the like. We saw the limits of the Thracian expansion to the coast on the west just before Aegean and Argyllos, which they're not obvious on this map. And now we go to the east, streamy east of, well, imagine Nestos somewhere here, okay, modern Nestos, ancient Nestos somewhere here. Streamy east of Nestos seems to have been the most important Thracian colony outside these limits, this little umbrella here, of the Thracian colonies, if it was a colony of Fasos, because there is no general agreement about that. Anyway, there is a lot of Attic pottery in Streamy, but it starts together with Avira, late 6th, early 5th century BC. Therefore, if it was a Thracian colony, it was probably a later one. In my view, Thracians reached Streamy after they gave up on the possession of the coast around Avira. But let's try to do some bridges and bridge the gaps, if we can. The first gap. Why did the people of Avira insist to stay in this area? They never left their city. In fact, new forces, new help came 100 years later after the first colonization from the Aegeans. The first generations were suffering a lot due to the harsh environment. There were no rich farmlands, this was out of the question, and there was only sea and swamps with sweet and salty water, as Herodotus says. What was so important there? Yes, we do know that there were metal ores in Thrace, but these metal ores are up on the mountains and not near the sea. In my opinion, we need to look for something that was very promising and very prominent, something that could be easily reached and traded through the coast. Maybe we need to think of something that it has not left any trace in the material record. And we know about the slave and the horse trade between the local Thracians and the Greeks. But one wonders if slaves and horses are enough to justify the importance of this God-forgotten swampy area. I want to offer an explanation about what was probably happening in this empty land, although a lot of work needs to be done and a lot of geological work. I want to point out the Great Forest, sometimes still known with the old name Kozaorman. You see a plan of the very few parts that remain today. Kozaorman is a riparian forest, which means that it receives frequent floods but helps control sediment, reduce the damaging effects of flooding, and aids in stabilizing stream banks. As many riparian forests around the world, unfortunately, this one has been cleared for agricultural use because of the good soil quality, while the trees were used constantly as wood fuel. Kozaorman is known at least until 1805 through the writings of a European traveler. I show you some photographs of them, remnants today. This forest, before World War II, extended to 130,000 acres and occupied almost 1/4 of the total area of the then Nestos Delta. Its trees were measured up to 40 meters high and 2 meters in diameter. I remind you that a 7-story apartment building is only 25 meters. During the Second World War and the Civil War that followed, about half of the forest was burned, and the rest, as I told you, was cut into farmland and used for fuel wood. Especially after the 1950s, while the authorities starting gradually changing the route of Nestos River into what we see today as the route. If this forest was also growing in antiquity, it would have been a unique source of ship timber, especially for the islanders of the South Aegean, that is, the Parians and the Naxians. I just show you a view of today's Koutsaorman to Thasos and to see how close it is, this area, to the island. The other gap, the choice of the bridge, is not accidental. I realize that it's very difficult to close these gaps, but I'm trying at least to give some suggestions. The explanation about the other gap, the absence of fine pottery, Attic fine pottery, all through the 6th century, the very few pieces of around 500, and the rise of imported pottery in the mid-5th century and later. What happened in the early history of Avira after the coming of the second wave of the colonizers from Teos in the mid-5th century? Whatever happened, the city became very powerful and a strong ally of the Persians. In fact, the earliest coins issued in Avira date around 520 BC, and they are very heavy octadrachms and tetradrachms. In other words, they were not used for everyday exchange, like shopping in the supermarket, but they were probably used to pay the Persian taxes. They were transactions with the Persian army. That is why their weight is connected with the thick gold Persian Daric coins. A Persian Daric coin equals to, in weight, to about 20 silver Abderan coins, to have an analogy. Second, whatever happened in the early years of the colonization of Thasos, Parian potters probably settled on Thasos from the beginning and manufacture what we call Thasian Parian pottery, among other things. There is also an important late 6th, early 5th century workshop excavated in Fari, in the west coast of the island, but none of these spots reaches Avira. Although they are so close to each other, you can, maybe you can swim, if you are a good swimmer, through Avira and Thasos, but with a small boat you can go back and forth in half a day. So, no Fari pottery, no Thasian Parian pottery, nothing that is obviously from Thasos comes to Avira. Although Fari-type pottery comes, for example, from this area of Dikia, which is further away from Thasos. Stream, just to remind you. I just show you the map. Fari is here, the city of Thasos is here. Of course, this is the Thracian coast, Avira is somewhere here, and I show you some examples of the Fari production, which is very indicative, very obvious, and I'm sure we could, recognize it if there was at least plenty of it. Interestingly enough, the most high quality fine Attic vases from Thasos seem to belong to the years before the middle of the 5th century. But what happens is that the 465 BC, Athens founded the colony of Amphipolis on the Strymon River. So now we left Nestos, we left the delta of Nestos and Avira, and we came here, the Strymon River. Thasos lost her interests in the mines of Mount Pangaeon, the gold mines of Pangaeon, and defected from the League. Well, the Athens could not leave this unpunished. After more than 2 years of siege, Thasos surrendered. As a result, the fortification walls were torn down. They had to pay yearly tribute and fines, and additionally, their land, naval ships, and the mines of Thasos were all confiscated by Athens. The siege of Thasos marks a transformation of the Delian League from an alliance into, in the words of Thucydides, an Athenian hegemony. There is no doubt that Thasos' heyday was in the Archaic period, and its occupation by the Athenians in 463-62 heralded the decline of its power and importance. But exactly the opposite happens in Avira, which was in good terms with Athens and the Athenian League, and where the most fine Attic vases arrived just after 460 BC. This picture goes very well with the wider image of the constant hostility and dispute between the two cities, Thasos and Avira, and the fact that they always try to take advantage of each other, to take over each other's allies and turn them into enemies, and so on, two cities that lie so close but so far away in many aspects. To return to pottery, finally. The picture of the Attic imports go well with the historical events. However, I'm well aware of the danger to slip into what Professor Anthony Snodgrass called positivist fallacy. That is the assumption that archaeological remains document significant historical events of the past. But I think that in this case, we can suggest that Thasos was the major transit center for fine Attic pottery, which was traveling from the south to the central Aegean Thrace until the middle of the 5th century, when major issues between Athenians and Thasos began. This can explain why only a few pots arrived to Avira until 460. In fact, because they were stopping in Thasos, and there was no connection between Thasos and Avira. Next to that, the hostility between the two cities can explain the fact that there is almost no trace of local Thasian Farid-type pottery, no Cycladic pottery, no trace from anything. After the middle of the 5th century, and while Amphipolis was growing in power, new transport and trade routes have opened between Athens and Thrace, not including Thasos this time, and there is enough evidence to show that the Athenian potters and painters came into closer contact with the Thracian clients. And when I say clients, I do not mean that all of the vases were bought directly by Thracians, but I mean that many of these could have been gifts or were thought appropriate for people of these areas. I will just remind you of a person who was close to both Athens and Thrace, the politician Nymphaderos, a citizen of Avira, whose sister married a Thracian king, Sitalkis. The Athenians, who had previously thought Nymphaderos was an enemy because he became friends with Sitalkis, his sister, made him a proxenos in 431, and through his mediation, they obtained the alliance of Sitalkis. So things were more complex than we think. Now, back to pottery. Again, in order to present some relevant evidence. In 2009, John Oakley commented on two red-figured cylindrical cups, beakers, he calls them, found in Bulgaria. This special shape derives directly from Thracian silver cups, a dozen of which are known until today. And these Thracian silvers over here show close affinities with similar Persian vessels of the 5th century, Achaemenid vessels. Oakley argued that the two Attic bakers, this one and this one, were made specifically for the Thracian market, as are a number of other Attic vessels found in Thrace. One such case is the biconical mugs, which were brought into our attention by Adrian Letzi-Hafter already in 1997. She presented two very important vases found in Apollonia Pontica. This is Apollonia Pontica, a colony of Miletos, modern Sozopolis in the Bulgarian coast of the Black Sea. There are two mugs of a Thracian shape, characterized by a biconical body, whose great diameter is nearer the foot than the mouth. They have a flaring offset rim and a high handle, and there is also a spare in the Attic. 1. The foot of the Attic vase is lost, but we have the foot of the local vase. The decoration shows 3 running Thracian warriors with colorful cloaks and specific attributes. 2 of them run afoot, the 3rd is on horseback. A house by Eretria painter, not shown here, was found also in the same area, and Nymphaderos proposed that this mug, and the house had been shipped together to this city. In fact, there are many specimens of fine Attic red figure vases of the second half of the 5th century from Apollonia. Interestingly enough, in 2005, another red figure mug of the Thracian form and the exact same decoration than the Apollonia Pontica one was published by Georgieva, and it was attributed again by Adrian Nymphaderos to the Eretria painter. It was found in a tumulus near Carnobat, about 20 kilometers from Apollonia Pontica to the west. This mug differs from the Apollonia one, this one, that it has the upper concave body and not a convex one, but I think it's obvious that the basic shape is almost the same. The foot of this one appears to be a Greek adaptation to the local shape, used instead of the most simple Thracian flowering foot, and I tried here to imagine this one, the Apollonia one, with this foot, copy-paste, and the foot of the Thracian plain jag from Apollonia. Anyway, and this is a drawing by Nymphaderos. Both these both the beakers that we saw before and these mugs show that there was a much closer relationship between Attic potters and painters and their Thracian markets than previously thought. Maybe a Thracian jug found its way to the Keramaikos of Athens with instructions to recreate the shape and add appropriate decoration, or in any case, both these mugs and the beakers must have been special commissions of some type, and they must have been ordered, sent, bought, gifted from Athenians to Apollonians, from Thracians living in Athens, from Apollonians or Thracians traveling to Athens and coming back, or by merchants who knew the taste of the clients in those areas. Of course, it has long been known that Attic potters and painters produced special vases for specific foreign markets, vessels that copied or were based upon foreign non-Attic shapes, and I just remind you the Nicosthenic amphoras, Aegean, which are good examples of the 6th century. But the 2 beakers and the 2 mugs are yet another example of how Attic potters copied an on-Attic shape. But during the last decades, it seems that there is another door that opens between Thrace and the Eretria painter's workshop. I refer to the well-known silver gilded vases, which belong to the same private Boskov collection with Oakley's red figure beakers that we saw before, and they have also been found in Bulgaria. Stylistic comparisons to contemporary Athenian vase painters suggest a date of circa 420-410 BC, and scholars who studied them say that they have many common elements with the workshops of the Eretria and the Midias painter. The iconography of these pots with the many, I saw you a very nice cantharos, orfeus, and a Thracian woman with tattoos. The iconography with many Thracian elements implies the involvement of an Athenian workshop, and we know that Athens was an important center for metalworking in the 5th century BC, but we cannot rule out the possibility that silver gilded vases like this were manufactured in one of the northern Greek colonies who had direct access to the raw materials and were close to the Thracian markets and the Thracian clientele. In any case, the craftsmen of these vases were familiar with the conventions and the repertoire of Athenian red figure vases. But if we go back to our most humble biconical mugs made of clay, the 2 pieces of the Eretria painter from Carnobat and Apollonia Pontica date around 425 or 120 BC, according to Let's Hafter. However, this very basic shape was found in a very humble vase in central Aegean Thrace, in the dried bed of the Lissos River, in a circle of graves, local Thracian graves. Of course, the graves, they were not initially in the river. The river used to run further south. Again, we have a case of another change in a riverbed through the ages. The vase is plain and handmade and can be dated to the 6th century BC, but the excavator, Diamantis Triadaphilos, could not give yet a more specific date. But even earlier, though, in the late 7th century BC, we have the same basic shape, but wheel-made and decorated in a Clazomenian grave in Avira. The decoration, this is the Abdera one, recalls Ionian prototypes, according to Ευτυχίας Καρλατίδου, who published it, but the shape is very interesting because it probably shows a fusion between local and imported taste. In other words, it could be a colonial local vase if we accept the various terminology. And if we go even further back in time, we have this. Local handmade late Bronze Age vase from a Thracian site in Kosinthos. This is another river, again, over here. Of course, this vase used to have two handles. It's broken. These are other vases, local Thracian vases found in the same cemetery, but I point out this one, of course. But the profile, the basic shape, I think it's very similar. I will end with this screen showing that there is much work to be done in order to see more clearly the nature of the relationship between the Athenian and other potters and painters and the Thracian market and the pottery of the colonizers, the Ionians who came to these places, because there is a symbiosis, which seems greater and more complicated than previously perceived. This is an object of a big research project. I'm not part of this project, but I just want to tell you. The AtticPot, which is a work in progress and aims to catalogue all the published Attic pottery from Thrace in order to contribute to the expansion of our knowledge on ancient Thrace, promote a deeper understanding of the diffusion of Attic pottery, and enrich the notion of interconnection between Athens and Thrace. As it should be the case with any ceramic and any scholarly study, I try to reach from pots to people, even if this is not possible to the extent that I and we would like, usually due to the unequal representation of all the terms of this complex polynomial function. Ancient texts, inscriptions, coins, excavation, random finds, among them pottery, anthropological findings, geophysical and paleontological research, etc., and of course all in various stages of study and publication or even unpublished. I guess we are all dizzy enough, so I will not ask you to do the math and solve the problem that I show you on the screen. That is why I want to finish my presentation with another aspect of Thrace, nothing to do with pottery, though. The formal folk dance festival is over, but no one wants to leave. No one. People from the audience start joining the dancers who still wear their beautiful traditional costumes. The circle opens and closes, sometimes in a slower motion, sometimes in quick swirlings. The leader of the dance changes after a couple of terms. All participants will lead at some point. And more people keep joining by breaking in the circle, but without stopping the movement. And you've shown me how to do it, but now... got it. Where is the music? Where is the sound? Sorry. There is no sound. If there is no sound, then there is no good. No. Well, I want to surprise you, but no. Γιατί, βρε? Well, I owe you the music. It was a beautiful music. It's okay, we'll put in the end of the conference. Muchas gracias a todos y especialmente a la profesor Carmen Sánchez por la invitación, pero sobre todo por su larga y valiosa amistad. Y al profesor Jorge Tomás, que se encargó de muchas cosas. You have to see the swirlings. It's changing now with the guidance. Okay.